You are listening to Paranormal Matters. I'm your host, Rick Fair. In this episode, I speak with Elorah Fangrad about her time living in a remote hunt camp in northern Ontario. A hunt camp is a regional term referring to a vacation destination for hunters, fishers, and eco-tourists. We occasionally mention the book Greening the Paranormal, which was edited by Dr. Jack Hunter and published in 2019 by August Night Press. In the summer of 2017, I was living in North Bay, but I had to return to southwestern Ontario for a family matter. And as I was passing through London, where I now live, I had a chance encounter with a former student of mine who's joining me today to talk about some experiences that she's had living up in northern Ontario. Her name is Elorah Fangrad. Elorah, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody.
Well, welcome. This is Paranormal Matters, and this is one of our very first episodes. And when I heard that Elorah was coming into town, I jumped at the chance, one, to hang out with her, but also to interview her for this podcast. So 2017, I'm just driving through town. I think it was early spring.
Yes, because I hadn't gone off to camp yet, and that work usually started early May.
Yeah, and we started sharing stories, and Elorah was sharing some fascinating stories about this hunt camp up north, where she was the caretaker, and she lived and worked for a number of summers, and then a number of years in the off season as well. And when she shared the initial stories that she did with me, my first response was, well, when can I come? Because it was such a fascinating story. And over the course of a couple of years, Elorah, myself, and Dr. Christopher Larson, we co-wrote a paper together that is in the book Greening the Paranormal. And it's sort of a chapter that's tucked at the very end, so bookending some really amazing essays in it. And our essay was called Psychic Naturalism, and it was all about the experiences that people report at this hunt camp in northern Ontario. So, Elorah, if we can go back in time to our initial meeting and those initial stories that you were sharing, when did you first notice something was really special about this place?
Well, I started work there in the spring of 2014. That was the first season. I was employed as a housekeeper server at the camp. I took a 24 or so hour bus ride from London up to the Wawa area. So I was quite sleep deprived and anxious, also anticipatory about starting this new job. I was picked up by the camp owners, and I would say, within a day or two of being on the property, I felt that there was a certain energy about it. It was sometimes so strong as I could walk up the driveway off the property down the logging road, and then coming back in, just being near the buildings, it almost felt like a wall of energy walking into this property, which is something I don't often feel. And then one of my first experiences, it was just a feeling, not any visual phenomena, but within the first week of work, I was asked to start opening up the cabins before guests showed up. And I was alone in one of the older cabins on the older property. And I just felt uneasy there, paranoid, like there was something watching me. And I did my work quickly and got out. And from there on, in the next 9 years that I worked at this property, I didn't willingly go into that cabin most of the time. So those were my earliest experiences, but I didn't start putting all these feelings and sensations together until more exciting events started happening later in the summer.
And so that was that initial summer?
Yes, and this was all the first year I was working there, and I was 20 years old at the time.
Okay, so what are some of the exciting things that would happen?
Later that summer, again, the months kind of blur into one another when you're working 7 days a week, kind of at all times. What first really started to get my attention was certain dream or nighttime experiences. I was living in a very small bedroom, let's say more so a closet in a boathouse perched over the rocks on an island. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I would wake up and my door, which was locked from the inside by myself before going to bed every night, this door sometimes would open by itself, and I never saw any presence or shape walk in, but I felt something enter, and I didn't know what it was, but that was quite striking to me, and it kept happening repetitively as well. So I started to think, oh, there is something going on here.
So these are stories that happened to you personally. Mm-hmm. When did the thread of other people's experiences begin to weave into this realization that, oh no, this isn't just me, this is something that's happening to others who are here?
Well, eventually, things did become, let's say, intense enough that I thought, I should bring it up to some of my coworkers, or let's say my employers. They're very friendly people. We all lived on site. We're all around each other 24/7, so you get to know people very well within the matter of a few weeks. So I ended up somehow, I don't remember how the conversations ever started, because, it's very easy to just get into a ghost story type situation around a campfire or on the deck after work, but I ended up speaking to the camp owners about some of these things probably around the middle of that first season, and then that's when they opened up to me completely about their own experiences, things which had happened to them when they were alone or when they were with other staff in the past, or experiences staff had reported to them. So that's when I realized there's something going on here on a much larger scale than just my own experiences. And other people were having similar experiences, let's say.
What about the guests? Were guests also reporting things?
Well, most guests, it was not a topic that would come up. Some people would... Let me think about it. So, in all of my years there, very, very rarely would any guests come up to any staff member and say, I think I saw a ghost, or something like that. But in all of the years that I was there, I can remember 2 distinct conversations I've had with guests. And it's important to note that these were long-time guests. A lot of guests at the lodge were coming to this specific spot for 10, 20, maybe even 30 years and knew the owners very well. They came to know me very well because I ended up working there for 9 years. So one experience that a guest came forward to us with was they noted that when staying in a specific cabin, they were woken up around, I believe it was 3 a.m. in the morning or so. They woke up to use the washroom and they saw a man cooking at their stove. Initially, this guest thought, oh, it was just one of my friends from the other bedrooms was up making something to eat. Then he realized it was not a person from their group. It was not a person at the lodge at all. And so this person, the next morning, I think it started just casually chatting with the dockhands who were getting their boat ready. This guest started telling the dockhand about it, and word spread to myself, and I learned that this was the same cabin where another guest, a longtime guest, had had the same experience at least probably 20, 30 years before. The same experience, and these people don't know each other at all. They're from different states and provinces, actually, so that was quite the interesting occurrence. Then another guest, a longtime guest who I met multiple times over the seasons, he expressed to me after myself and another staff member had experiences in the cabin he was staying in, a week or two before. He came to me and said, well, my family experienced this feeling in the cabin, and he was very open to talking about it. And he also mentioned seeing light phenomena out on the lake. So there are certain things guests would say, but most people, it just didn't come up as a topic of conversation.
So what do people say about light phenomena?
Well, I had heard that seems to be a very common experience of anything up there. So my boss himself had seen some things. Again, longtime guests had reported being out fishing at night and seeing blindingly bright, large lights appear overhead when they are out in the middle of the bush fishing late at night. And this light just staying above them in a sustained manner. And often when people recounted these things, they'd say, oh, maybe it was a UFO, or something like that. So people are definitely thinking along that line, but not necessarily drawing to a conclusion.
So would you say that, or what would you say is the strangest phenomenon that people reported to you?
Well, see, for me, my own experiences on the property tend to be in a different manner than other people's. So, for example, I don't believe I ever saw what some people would describe as a human-shaped figure or a ghostly figure at all. I never saw anything of that sort. However, one of the more frequent reports that I would receive from the staff were, I saw a figure in the cabin while I was working. It was a light outline of a human, or it was a dark shadow person, or it was the full-bodied apparition of a person that I recognized as a person. Then I realized they were in the wrong time frame, the wrong clothing. They weren't actually a guest at the lodge, and they kind of disappeared. Those were all things that were reported to me, and I found those some of the most remarkable reports because I didn't have any of those experiences personally. So it's interesting when people encounter things in a different way than I do. So I find those the most strangest, we could say.
So would people say they were dressed in old-fashioned clothing?
The one encounter I was mentioning there, it was a staff member in one of the lounge buildings, and he was in there, I think he was sleeping, then he woke up. He said he saw an older gentleman dressed in clothing probably from the 70s, 80s, and this camp had been around much longer than that. But this guest was wearing clothing with a very old camp logo, which hadn't been used in 20 to 30 years. Some guests, very few guests, do have those very old souvenirs and wear them. But there was no one on the property that week who had any of this clothing or looked like the person described. And this employee knew that because we're very close to the guests. We see all the guests every day. So you get to know very quickly who's on the property and who isn't, right? And then later on, he was looking through some of the old hats and memorabilia we have on site, and he said, yeah, this person was wearing this hat, and that hat was from, I think, the early 1980s, and no one on site had any of this clothing. And he did say, I believe this was a spirit, a ghost, because they weren't anywhere else on the property. They just appeared for this short moment in time. And to also add to this is a remote property. We don't have people just wandering in from anywhere. You might get a few local people, but we know who those people are, and they are nothing like this person being described.
It's also a very specific description.
It was a very, very specific event, and I've only had something like that reported once. Although, the event that I previously mentioned about the man appearing at the stove in the same cabin, probably decades between sightings, that, again, was described as being fully human in appearance. Like, people did not know at first glance that it wasn't one of their friends or someone from a different cabin. Then they realized that it just disappeared or it wasn't human. So a couple of those experiences, but those would be very rare. And so, for that reason, that's probably why they stick out in my mind the most.
This is interesting to me because when I think of the stories that you shared with me and with Christopher, there's a thread that is about you and your encounters there, but from what you're saying, it seems like this is possibly decades of people reporting events.
Oh, for sure. So I should point out that the owners of this camp purchased the property in the early 90s when they were in their 20s, and they successfully continue to run this business, we're at 30-something years at this point. So they recounted to me some experiences that their staff had probably back in the 90s. So it's good to have them as a consistent source and keeper of these stories, and they're very interested in it, so they were very willing to speak about it with me when I mentioned I experienced this. Then they said, oh, well, this one employee 10, 15, 20 years ago, well, they said that this happened to them, or they said, well, I had this experience myself in this cabin 20-something years ago. So it was hard to find any information beyond that. There are some employees who are around in the 70s, 80s, on and off, and other local cottagers in the area, but those were some of the earliest things that we could pick up on.
Now, I had mentioned at the beginning that yourself, Christopher, and I developed, we developed this relationship and wrote this paper that, the three of us can be really proud of, in which we describe this methodology of psychic naturalism. And I actually went up to the hunt camp. So, when I first met you, my question was, well, when can I come up? I'm always inviting myself to places. And this wasn't an exception. But before we talk a bit about that experience, I'm curious, what was that experience like for you, doing research and writing the paper that we ended up writing for Jack Hunter's book?
Well, for me, it was somewhat already what I was doing personally. So, Rick, before we had discussed the project and before it was even an idea, again, I had started work in 2014. So I just started hearing stories from staff basically every season, writing down some of my own experiences. So I had already been casually keeping track of phenomena for 3 years prior to this. So when Rick and Christopher approached me about doing the work, I said, okay, I don't think it will be a problem. Where it's going to be challenging sometimes is getting people to speak about their experiences. That is sometimes the most difficult part. And the other difficult part for me is because I'm very open about talking about my own experiences, especially around the campfire, late at night. It was hard for me to not speak to people right away as soon as they mentioned, oh, I had this experience last night, I want to go and enthusiastically explain all the years of things that have happened to me. But then I didn't want to start to influence others through this project. So it was in some ways difficult to be objective when you're on scene and living and working with your main confidants, the main sources of your information. And we did not openly explain the project to any guests. And mainly for the reason that it's not something that most guests would probably respond well to, is what we thought. We have a very specific demographic of generally repeat visitors, and these conversations hadn't come up with most people. And we also didn't want to make the project entirely public and say we have a haunted property or something of the sort, because you don't want certain attention which could be negative when you're trying to market and run an established business where the focus is fishing and hunting, not any sort of paranormal attraction.
I think that you're building on a strong theme that we considered throughout the research of our paper, and that is, in my mind at least, the paranormal phenomenon often happens peripheral to where our attention is focused, right? So it's not like you look at a specific item on a shelf and then that item falls. It's when you're in the other room that item falls, or you're asleep and your consciousness is altered that something happens, or you're walking on a trail and your attention might be drifting, that something happens, and it's sort of at the last second you're thinking, oh, well, what the heck was that? Now, interestingly, when I went there, I was received as an expert. And I was like, no, nothing of the sort. I'm not an expert in anything, really. I'm just curious.
Well, you do know a lot.
Oh, thank you. But in my mind, what was kind of happening was a lot of attention was paid to the experiences and to the events. And I'm just curious, do you think that our attention to the events and to the stories influenced or had an impact on the phenomenon that happens up there?
I think in some part it could, if staff were really aware of it. However, one thing to note about this business is it's generally very different staff per seasonal hiring period. There were a few people like myself who worked for several years on end, but typically you'd get new people every summer. So there wasn't a lot of continuity, or there wouldn't be a lot of senior staff influencing junior staff. So yeah, I guess that's how it is.
That's interesting. Stories can have some influence and some perhaps fertilization of expectation that maybe something will happen.
Yes. Well, even before we started our project, I wouldn't tell people all my experiences right at the start of the season. Mostly because, don't want to terrify people. You don't want to terrify people when the working conditions are you're often in a outpost cabin alone for several hours in the bush, and that's frightening enough to most people. Isolating to most people, so you don't want to up the emotions that they're already feeling about the job or experiencing on site by saying, well, when I was in that cabin, this phenomena appeared, I absolutely didn't want to set up for the season in that way with my staff.
So you would let them approach you?
Yeah, and very often in the early few weeks of the season, things would already be happening. Either to myself alone, to other staff alone, or there were experiences where both staff and I experienced things at the same time. And then that would start leading to conversations throughout the season.
Okay, wow. So as part of our research, you kept a journal, which was shared on the cloud with Christopher and I. And as I was preparing for our interview today, I went through and I was reading through some of your accounts, and I was surprised. I remember you reporting this, but I was surprised the other day to see that people reported encounters with you when you weren't there. So I want to actually frame this to say one way to state this is, or one word that is often used is by location. So somebody being multiple locations simultaneously, which is, in the materialist sense, quite impossible. So I'd like to share a couple of your accounts that you had written in the journal. So this one is from June 15th, 2020. Quote, the camp owner reported hearing someone walk on his porch and say, hello, in a woman's tone around 1:40 a.m. He thought that it was me and said it sounded exactly like me. I verified it was not myself, and I was sleeping at the time. The other staff in the room between my room and the owner's room did not hear anything. The other female staff confirmed they were all sleeping at that time. As we discussed this incident over breakfast at 9:20 a.m., the hydro flashed off for a minute with no scheduled outages known. It was frightening timing, and
yes,
I thought...
It was very dramatic. Made the whole experience much more dramatic.
No kidding. And continuing on with the quote, I thought it was an odd coincidence. Later, the power went out again, so it didn't seem to be related. Or so we think, you add. Mm-hmm. And then you continue. Later in the morning, a staff member said, she heard my voice say hello outside her cabin, but I did not go over there or say that. She was present when the owner was talking about his experience at breakfast. And then you conclude by saying, these two incidents remind me of something that happened in 2016. An employee said that while she was setting up for breakfast in a remote lodge in the dining room around 6 a.m., she saw me enter the laundry room and walk back and forth by the kitchen door. I was definitely not out of bed at that time. I am also reminded of the 2019 incident where multiple people reported hearing my voice and an unfamiliar male voice conversing in my room, while I can guarantee I was asleep and alone. Curiously, no one has reported seeing or hearing a different employee. It's always being related to me in these cases so far. So I'm curious, Elorah, what are you thinking about when I read these excerpts of your time at the hunt camp and other people hearing and seeing you in places you definitely were not?
Well, first of all, it's not my first experience with this. I did have a certain account that happened to me back in high school times, so I wasn't necessarily surprised, let's say. Of course, I don't understand what's going on, but it wasn't a completely new idea to me. So when I was back when I was in high school, was Monday, one of my acquaintances came up to me and they continued this conversation saying, this weekend when you told me, and continued a conversation as if we had been talking about the topic earlier. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. We were both just getting more and more confused. And she said, well, when you were at my house this weekend at this party, you were at this place in my house and we were talking about this. And I had not even been invited to this social event and had no idea it was happening. But this acquaintance was so sure I had been in her house having a conversation with her. So I never really thought much of that event throughout high school. I just thought, like, oh, maybe there was some drinking involved there. I'll never know. I'll just never know what happened. I wasn't able to get back in touch with that person. I don't think they ever would remember that happening even. So, this has already happened to me once in my life. I didn't think much of it until, looking at these camp experiences years and years later. So, not a surprise, but still not something I understand, if I can put it that way. And it's interesting that people report it's only me. One reason psychologically might be that in 7 out of those 9 years, I was a manager. And I was kind of intentionally all over the place every day, as myself in my own body, right? I would be checking on people and what they're doing all around the property all the time. So maybe that somehow does psychologically carry over to employees when they're trying to interpret a voice that they heard or a shape that they see. And I'm not attempting to explain away the phenomena, but I know I was likely in people's consciousness in that way. They would expect me to be watching them or to be there early in the morning or things like that. And I also think, again, going back to some of what was written in our chapter in Greeting the Paranormal, I think, there could be a trickster element to the spiritual realm, things within the spiritual realm, but I have absolutely no answers as to why my voice or characteristics would be mimicked.
Yes. And we do write about the trickster element in Greeting the Paranormal and in Psychic Naturalism, in which we quite deliberately say at the beginning, or close to the beginning, that there are patterns in nature that repeat themselves over and over and over again. That's the process of nature, is this repetition of patterning over and over again. And the hunt camp itself is fairly remote and in a beautiful natural setting. And it's almost as if the familiarity of your presence and people's consciousness and perception are having an interplay, perhaps, again, psychologically, or perhaps eco-psychologically. I'm not defining and not trying to put a label on it, but it seems to be some wondrous things at play when people are seeing you, hearing you in places that you are most definitely not. So, yeah, very interesting. So as part of our research, I went up to the hunt camp, as I shared at the beginning of our interview, and that happened to be a 12-hour drive from where I was living. And that's the one thing people don't appreciate about Northern Ontario. It's literally the size of France, but with like less than 800,000 people. So you go for a long drive, it's 12 hours, and maybe you'll come across a couple towns here or there. So like you, I kept a journal of my time there, and I want to share with you just a short entry just before my visit. So I wasn't actually at the hunt camp. October 6, 2017. Interestingly, last night I dreamt I was sitting by the lake at night, and across the water I could see a light hovering above the opposite shore. I recalled hearing that when you see a deer, it is not wise to stare it directly in the eyes, as this is how a hunter stares at its prey, with its eyes facing forward. So I looked at the ground before me, and the light moved across the lake and hovered in the air right in front of me. Then I woke up. So it was a very anticlimactic end of the dream, but that was the dream. So then I went to visit the hunt camp, and we did our observations to write the paper Psychic Naturalism with Christopher. We didn't include in our paper the following event, which I noted in my October 10th journal entry about an incident that happened as I was packing my car earlier that morning before returning home. So this was definitely not a dream, but this actually happened as I was getting ready to leave. So October 10th, quote, I looked up through the clearing in the canopy and could see a lone satellite moving from north to south. Then, through the treetops, I saw two much brighter lights moving from the northeast to the southwest. They were slower and much brighter than the first light. I continued to watch them and wanted to call out to the nearby camp owner, but I also didn't want to break the quiet. As I watched, they simultaneously dimmed to pinpricks of light. One light was in front of the other, and they were both brilliantly white. I only remembered afterwards that I didn't follow my advice in the dream. In my excitement, I couldn't take my eyes off these lights. So again, it was anticlimactic, but it was peculiar because I did not in any way see these as being normal. Something was off about the presence of these two lights. There was a satellite that preceded it, so I had a frame of reference for what a satellite looks like. But then these two blindingly bright lights flying directly over me was really peculiar. So I don't know why I didn't speak up at the time to say, hey, we need to include this. Mm-hmm. And I'm just kind of curious. It has me wondering how often people at the hunt camp and perhaps people in general experience something that can't easily be explained. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. Sometimes things can't be explained, so I'm just not going to talk about it.
Yeah, well, for myself, I'd continue this sentence as, I'm just not going to talk about it at this time, because for me, sometimes it isn't out of shame or fear of confusion that I won't speak of things. It's that something doesn't necessarily make sense to me yet regarding some sort of experience I've had. Sometimes it's taken years for me to ponder an experience and then later, years later, have the words to explain the pictures that I remember in my head. So for me, it's just that the mind needs to find some kind of pattern to events sometimes to even begin to explain what it was that happened. And one line that came to me when I was thinking about this interview question ahead of time, it's stories follow their own formation and timeline. Of course we are in control of our own imagination and how we process information, but I think there's also an aspect to our memory and narrative that certain events or pictures take time to put themselves together. So that's at play in our minds with us.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say with that particular incident with, the lights that I saw, I don't have an answer. I don't have something that says, oh, this is what it was and this is what it means. But for me, that's okay as well. It's just,
Yes.
It's like, I don't want to smother the experience with a definitive response. This is what it was. But it's rather just let it have oxygen and let it sort of ruminate in my mind and just appreciate it for the mystery that it was. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious, how have things changed from the best of your recollection Have you had anybody tell you what's happening there now?
So the book chapter was published in 2019. I'm not sure how much of the 2019 fieldwork was included in our chapter or not, because we did always consider doing a part two, right? Even before we were finished part one. And then what happened in between that was, of course, COVID hitting in 2020 that completely decimated the tourism industry. So we went from being very, very full, lots of human and spiritual energy, let's say, from the time I was working between 2014 to late 2019. And then when COVID hit, we had almost no guests because most of the guests in that region are American, and the border was closed for almost 2 summers, I think it was. So we just had very few Canadian guests. We had a very small staff. And there was definitely a different spiritual feeling around the properties, let's say, because cabins that would normally be booked back to back and be filled with that human presence and energy, they could be sitting empty for, a month at a time, and I'd just be going there alone to do some cleaning or maintenance or whatever. And one of the main lodges didn't even run for almost 2 years, but we were out there every few days, of course, keeping up with the maintenance. But when you have certain human presence or not, I find that really influenced the energy surrounding properties and cabins.
So would you say the absence of human presence meant the absence of the presence itself, the paranormal presence?
So I did actually look through before this interview my own notes in my little paranormal log journal. So much of the reporting that was included in Greening the Paranormal, I can just read off some of the phenomena here. So between 2014 to 2019, what is captured in the Psychic Naturalism chapter is multiple sightings of light or dark figures or figures that appeared to be human, as we've already discussed in some of the earlier questions. And sudden manifestations of walls of cold air appearing, sometimes alone, sometimes at the same time as other phenomena. Voices, male or female, around buildings, properties, the forest around the property. We had a number of what I guess we could classify as poltergeist experiences, with items moving on their own accord. Tossed, thrown, pushed, shaken is what I wrote in the chapter. Many footsteps, many light forms or unidentified objects in the sky. So those were all things which were happening when we had a large staff, anywhere between 10 to 15 full-time employees. Most cabins reserved full-time, every part of the property in full operation. Those were some very noticeable, visually loud phenomena, let's call it, right? So something that you would notice even above all of this human energy and the human goings on day to day. So that's primarily what I wrote about in our chapter. However, I did keep tracking experiences that happened. Of course, this would be mainly to the staff once COVID hit. We were down to, I think, at certain points between 4 to 8 employees, definitely like half of the workforce or less. The camps were generally mostly empty. We were just doing maintenance. Curiously, looking back on what each year was, I don't really know if anything even was reported in 2021. Curiously enough, the 2020 season had the bilocation experiences you mentioned, and 2022 there were a few events once we did reopen. But mainly what I noticed was my entries were very short, so they weren't events that we thought about a lot or were very perplexed by, aside from some of the bilocation events. But More so, like, everything was very quiet. So I very often heard, like, footsteps and voices. So, you're not seeing real humans around all the time making these noises, but there's still that energy and presence around an empty property, curiously enough. But yeah, we just didn't. Maybe it was due to having less staff, you have less experiences, far less guests, you have far less of a chance of anyone mentioning an experience, right? And I think what I always noticed at the beginning or end of every season, like before COVID, was when you first come into a property that's been vacant for about 6 months of the winter, there is a certain energy there. Then, as the staff start living there, opening everything up for the season, it does get a different energy. And then in the fall, we'd start closing cabins down, around September, October, but some of us staff stayed all the way through October. And when you'd go back to something that's been empty for several weeks, you kind of start to notice a different energy without the human presence. So, COVID or not, there was kind of that seasonal cycle that I noticed.
Oh, fascinating. So it sounds to me as though you have both while you were there and in your absence, you've done a lot of processing on the events, your experiences there, the experiences of others. I'm curious how your time there has helped shape your understanding of reality.
Well, in my life before working there, which would have been my teenage years as I started working there when I was 20, I didn't have many notable phenomena happen to me. A few distinct experiences in high school maybe, and that was it. So I wasn't really thinking of the world in very spiritual terms until I started having many more interactions with things which I considered to be spiritual. So after beginning to be on this property, experience things I hadn't experienced before, I started to see the world in a much more spiritual manner. There's many more entities than us humans there.
Do you think that it being situated in nature has a strong, or perhaps no, or what influence do you think its presence in nature has on the phenomenon?
Well, my initial answer to this would be it's a very, very isolated spot. My main environment was boat and fly-in only, so there's no traffic, hardly any people aside from the guests that you have, so it's much more mentally isolating than one would necessarily realize. To me, it became ordinary, but I always wonder, is that a factor playing in the back of my mind that I'm not conscious of when I'm experiencing things? Not to say, oh, it's my own mind playing tricks on me, but I'm open to that always being part of this phenomenon, right? So I think when I'm outdoors, I actually like being alone, unless I think there's like an animal coming after me or something, I actually spent 2 winters up at the camp during COVID doing some winter caretaking. And I was often alone for a week or so at a time. Not mentally isolated because I had a telephone, internet. Sometimes my local friends would swing by on their snowmobiles. But for me, being out there alone, it wasn't disturbing as it is to some people. I mean, I had employees who would quit within a matter of weeks because they couldn't mentally handle just the silence out there, the wide open space, just how different it is from being in an urban environment. I mean, for example, I remember one housekeeper, There was a cabin with a trail maybe a few hundred feet between it to another cabin. And I had one employee who was fine when she was with multiple people working in one cabin. Then I said, okay, after you're done a certain task there, come over to the other one down the trail. And within a few hundred feet of being in the bush alone, this person was panicking. So some people react to the isolation in nature in a very panicked way, and I wonder if that sometimes influences what they're perceiving around them.
Yeah, I think there's so much to think about with what you just shared. And I know from my experience, when I went there, I returned to North Bay, and one of the last entries I had in my journal was simply the intrusion of comfort. And that was it. And I think I wrote that because I guess the idea of certainty, the idea of comfort and enclosure is much different than the potential uncertainty and discomfort of an open space where you don't have easy access to anything you need 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's quite a different reality when you're in the urban comforts and when you're in a place more closely nestled in nature. So yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said about that. And to think that at one point, all of our ancestors were living in the areas that were much more closely nestled in nature and did not have the comforts that we have, did not have electricity or running water. So the world was much closer to them. Reality was much closer to them. And also the potential that it could end at any moment. So I wonder if that experience or those experiences would have lent themselves to a more storied existence where when something happens, you pay attention to it because it could be quite revelatory of your condition and your potential condition. If you see a specter, if you hear something that isn't right, you see a light in the sky, it probably has much more bearing on your existence or potential end to your existence than if it happens in the city. So if it happens in the city, it might be much easier to discount.
Oh, for sure. I mean, for example, let's say there's some kind of light phenomena in the sky, which was a frequent enough experience to me and some other people, right? So I think in a more urban area where you've got many more aircraft, many more lights and towers and things like that, you might not even really pick something off the horizon with your eyes because of all the information in front of you, right? Whereas if you're sitting on a deck in an entirely dark environment late at night where you don't have any of that light pollution, you don't really have much on your mind, there's no buildings obscuring the horizon, if you see something, your eye will go right to it in the sky and you'll ask yourself, what is that orb there? What is this approaching me? So I think there's just much less mental distraction.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying, that I'm not discounting experiences that happen in cities and urban areas, but I think that the nature of them and the nature of how we perceive them is fundamentally different depending on where we are situated when these things happen. All right. I appreciate so much your time, Elorah. Can I ask you what you're up to now?
Sure. So, I did end up leaving the camp at the end of the 2022 season on good terms with the property owners. It was simply that, due to what happened to the industry during COVID, I'd been through so much stress and uncertainty, and a lot of the terms of employment in that type of industry had changed. So I thought, I want to try something different after I've worked this job throughout almost all of my 20s, right? I just wanted to try something different. And I had gone to school for, well, initially a Bachelor of Theology with with a minor in Indigenous Studies, which is where I met Rick and his wife. And then I ended up doing a diploma in Indigenous Wellness and Addictions Prevention. So I've always had an interest in the mental health field. So after resigning from the camp work in late 2022, I now work at an Indigenous healthcare organization in northwestern Ontario in the mental health field.
You know what I think? I think we should visit the hunt camp again.
We should.
It's like getting the band back together, and perhaps it can be in the off season, and we will extend the invitation to Christopher.
That would be good. I mean, I think the camp owners would be up for it if we could all arrange it.
Right? Because we're going to write a follow-up to psychic naturalism.
See, so I did show the Greening the Paranormal book to a number of my new coworkers in my new workplace, and they all said at the end, "You said you were going to do a part 2. Well, where is part 2?" And I said, COVID was an obstacle to that, but we can plan something for the future.
Absolutely. And I think we will. So thank you once again, Elorah, for joining me on my podcast, one of the first interviews. And I'm sure you will be a repeat guest, but considering you're going back up to northwestern Ontario, it might have to be through Zoom.
Oh, for sure.
All right.